Computer Science 20 Python students, we are moving on to lesson number 16, functions. Functions are a big part of Python. You'll use them a lot. They simplify things, they make things a lot simpler. And function is just a program within a program. So let's jump into that. Lesson 16. Okay, one way to look at a function is to think of a program within a program. The computer gets to a line of code that has a function. Okay, we tell it to run a series of commands when it runs that function. So we're going to have our function here, and then inside it we're going to have a series of commands. So if you're doing something over and over and over again, you're doing some type of check over and over and over again, like say you want to check whether or not numbers are even or odd, rather than having to type out the code each time you want to do that, you create a function that checks it for you, and then you just run the function and apply the number that you want to check. Okay, that's the basic definition of a function. Now there's 4 types of functions we're going to go through here. Some of them you'll never use, but I want to touch on all of them. Okay, so the first one is you're not going to assign a value and you're not going to return a value. So when we look at this one here, we instantiate a function by using def. Okay, so def, and now print pi is the name of our function. And when we're using a function, you can always tell it's a function by the brackets that follow it. This is where some type of information is supposed to be expected. Not in this one because we're not assigning a value to it. Okay, the only function of this function is that we are going to print 3.14159 every time that we use that function. Okay, so anytime we call print pi, anytime we call print pi, it's going to output the number that we've entered into it. Okay, so we can see it used here. So we have create our function called print pi, colon, and now what happens when we run this function is it prints 3.14159. Okay, anytime we use it. We could be using it down here in our code. We could call that function, it'll print 3.14159. There's no value in it. All it's doing is outputting a specific value. It's not returning anything. All it has is that exact number, and it prints that number out at any time. So you can see that over here, prints it out for you just like that. Okay, next type. The next type is you're going to assign a value but not return it. Okay, so now we're assigning a value using x in here. So we're saying something is going to happen to x. When you call this function, or when you use this function, you're going to have to use it with the number that you want to apply here. All right, so we have def, we call the name of our function print double, and we put x in the brackets after it, and then we say anytime you run this function, print whatever x is times 2. Okay, and then we can call that function using the 2 inside the brackets, and it should output us 4. Okay, so when we come to our actual code to look at it, so I have my function here, the name of it is print double, and then I want to print x times 2. Now I don't know what I was doing here with this example, but let's do something simple. Okay, so I'm going to call this function, I'm going to say print double, and I want to print double using the number 50 because I have assigned value in here. It's going to print x times 2, so it's going to type print 50 times 2. Okay, now it'll do that with any number I put inside the brackets. Okay, any of them all the way through over and over again. That's the second function. The third one, it's not very useful. I don't know where you would use it specifically, but you're not going to assign a value, but you're going to return a value. So in this function, you call it getPy, and it returns 3.14. Okay, now because it doesn't assign any value when we run it, we get no output. In order to get the correct output, we have to use the function and further code within our program. Okay, so let's go in and take a look at it. Okay, so we create our function here. Anytime we use it, it's going to return this number. Okay, and then we use it further on our code, and we say x equals getPy. So now the value of x is going to be 3.14159 because anytime you use this function, it returns 3.14159 to anything that you have applied it to. So the value of x here is now this number, so when we print it, that's what we get as an output. I mean, obviously it's get used somewhere. I just don't know where we would use that one specifically. Okay, the last type. This is the one that you do a little bit more work with. You'll use more often. I think you assign a value and you return a value. Okay, so for this function, we're going to assign a value, which will be the variable, and we're returning a value, which will be assigned within the function. Okay, so we have def get double, and we have our assigned value inside the bracket of y. And then we say return y times 2. All right, so now it's not going to print it, it's just going to return it. So if you think back to Scratch, when we would broadcast something, that's kind of what's happening here. We are returning a specific value, and then you can print it or do whatever you want to do with it later. All right, so here's our example. So we have our get double. Anytime we use this function, it's going to times whatever number we put in the brackets by 2. And then if we want to print it, we can print it. Okay, so we create a variable called a. We call our function using the number 4. Now, without printing it, nothing's going to happen. All we've done is used it to assign a value to a based on our function. So we throw it in here as 4. When we print a, the value of a is going to be 8 because we assigned it to times by 2. Now, this seems very, very simple, but it's just to help you understand. You can have multiple commands inside of a function. You're going to see that next as we throw some conditionals into our functions. Okay, so if we want to check which number is greater, okay, rather than having to type out code each time we want to check the number, we create a function called getGreatest. So we want it to return the greater number. So every time we do it, so if you're doing this in a game or something like that, if two people are, you're going against the computer and we want to see which player had the higher score, return the higher score. This is how you would do that. So you want to get greatest. We have 2 assigned values of b and c. And then inside our function, we say, if b is greater than c, return b, else return c. So what that's going to do is it's going to return the larger number. Because if b is not greater than c, obviously c is larger and it returns c. Okay, so let's look at it specifically. Okay, so we have our variable here, which we just went through, b and c. If b is greater than c, return b, else return c. So then I put 2 numbers in here. So I make b 30 and c 20. So it's going to return the higher number regardless of what we type. Okay, it returns 30. Now if I change this to 40, it runs the else and returns 40. If I make it the same, what's going to return? Because it's not greater, it's going to return the C. Okay, and it's tough to see this because we don't have it labeled, but because B is not greater than C, it's returning C in this situation because we're just going to return 30. But that's why you want to include greater than or equal to. Okay, so that is the get greatest. This one's a little bit more complicated, and I talked about it a little bit earlier. Okay, so if you wanted to check if something was even or odd, we're going to have to go back to using modulus, which is a few lessons ago. But you remember that modulus is not divide. Okay, it's not going to give you the quotient or whatever the product of the division is. It's going to give you the leftovers. Okay, so if you apply modulus to anything, it will give you what's left over when that number has been divided. Okay, so if we divide something by 2, if there's 0 left over, the number was even, meaning 2 fit into it perfectly. Right? If it has a 1 left over, that means that 2 didn't fit into it perfectly, therefore it's odd. All right, so we create our function called isEven, and we assign the value d. That's where we're going to put in whatever number we want to check for odd or even. Okay, then we say if d modulus 2 equals 0. So we're saying if 2 fits into it perfectly with no remainder, return true, else return false. So when we put the number in, we're saying if this number is divisible by 2, it's an even number, therefore return true. So that's all our function does, is check to see if the number is true or false. Okay, so let's look at it. So we have our function created here, so nothing's happening until we use this function. Now we say now we say we have it set up here, so we have to actually use it somewhere. So we're going to use it within this second if statement, and we're going to insert the value 43. So we're saying if even 43 equals true, we want to print out the string even, we want to print out the string odd, because we want to make sure that the user understands specifically what's happening. So rather than just print out true if it's even or false if it's odd, we're using the true false as a way to indicate which string we're going to print out. So that's what our second if statement here is. So we put in 43, which is an odd number, and when we run it, it comes up as odd. Okay, if we change it to 44 and we run it, it becomes even. Okay, that's all through that function there. And I'm hoping you can see this as in a larger scale of things if you wanted to do the same function multiple times. Creating the function is an easier way to do it than to go back and forth over and over again and retype that same code. Okay, that's functions. You're going to mess around with those in the next assignment. Please let me know if you have any questions and we can figure it out.